Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Coach's Log, brought to you by me, Coach Rob of Positive Performance Coaching. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about honoring illness and injury as an athlete. Regardless of what athlete you are, the discipline that you participate, I think everyone needs to think about honoring illness and injury. This came about, I have this conversation usually in the off season, all the way up into early spring, and I am a victim. So last week I started feeling a little out of sorts, and of course, with the times being what they are, it's a very paranoid moment. Am I getting something that I really don't want, or is this just maybe some residual fatigue from a long training block? All kinds of thoughts went through my head, but the first one came up was honor the injury and or honor the illness. In either case, what that simply means is being smart, not pushing your luck, and taking some time down. In my particular case, it appears that maybe I've got a mild sinus infection, or maybe just maybe it's a reaction. The prior week, I was actually doing some work outside, not training, just some work on property, and ended up with a tick bite. And on the same day, a spider bite. So I think that I've got two things going on. I think I've got some allergy issues. I don't think it may really be a sinus infection. And I had that as well. It's not, thankfully, it's not COVID. There's been no temperature recorded, no dry cough, none of the typical symptoms that come along with it. But definitely been very, very careful. Actually kind of quarantined myself for 48 hours. That's why you guys didn't get any videos last week, to be perfectly blunt. I was kind of tired and worn down from it all and just felt inflamed. But that being said, what does it mean to honor an illness or an injury? Like I said, it means taking the time down and respecting the illness or an injury. I think the big takeaway from this is on the other side of this, when I talk with athletes, they're like, oh man, I've got to take a few days down, I'm going to lose fitness. No, you're not going to lose fitness. You may need a few days to get your legs back, but you haven't really lost fitness. I think that we often go to the subjective, how I feel, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to feel tired, you're going to feel worn out, you're not going to feel like yourself for a while. But in actual fitness terms, when we start talking about those measures, we've talked about on this channel things like FTP, and we're going to talk about a lot more measures in the very near future, because FTP isn't the gold standard. There are many more things that we can be looking at that will give us better indications of fitness or where you have a strength or a weakness. And we will talk about that in future episodes. But right now, what I want to talk about is probably the really biggest indicator in endurance sports is VO2 max, your maximum oxygen consumption rates. And depending on where you are as an athlete, whether you're just getting started or you're an old hat, you've been doing this for a long time and you're racing elite or professionally, you may have a relatively low VO2 score or you may have a very high VO2 score. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons or the pluses and minuses and kind of give you a range. It could be as low as 40, 45, and it could be as high as 80, and even in some cases, very rare cases, well into the low 90s. That would be exceptional. And if you're not there, don't sweat it. There are all kinds of ways to be a very strong, fast athlete without having big scores. It's not the whole picture. However, when we're talking about illness and injury, I do tell my athletes quite often, you're not going to start seeing a true decline in fitness until you have been sedentary for approximately 2 weeks. Why approximately? It goes back to that old coach's adage, it all depends on the athlete. Everybody's different. But I think that's a good rule to follow. You're probably not going to see a true decline in your peak VO2 or your VO2 max until about 2 weeks. And even then, you're looking at maybe less than a full percentage point, and maybe 2%. That would be unusual. I think that that would be pretty severe. That could very well have been a very serious upper respiratory infection. But if you're talking about the flu, dealing with allergies, cold, Maybe you had an overuse injury that kept you down for a couple of weeks or maybe a little bit longer. What does that look like? Well, the farther you go out being sedentary, and I'm talking about surfing the couch with zero activity. You're sitting at a desk, you're surfing the couch, maybe you're even a little bedridden. You're probably going to start thinking about after 3 weeks, you're going to start losing more off of the VO2. Notice how I didn't say much of anything else. We don't really start losing other things such as muscle mass until you've been down for approximately 3.5 to 4 weeks. And then it all kind of goes downhill from there. You are going to lose more muscle. You are going to lose more off of your VO2. Now, I haven't talked about things like FTP or critical power, anaerobic power, or anything along the power curve. When you start to lose your VO2 max ceiling, you start losing opportunity on FTP. Your FTP will shrink over time. There is no given factor for what that looks like. It depends on age, depends on experience, depends on level of athleticism. There's all kinds of things that go into that, whether you're just going to bounce right back and the very next day produce the same FTP that you had before you got sick or injured. The answer to that is definitely a no. And that's not going to happen. But fitness is not necessarily FTP. Fitness is not necessarily anaerobic. What we're looking at are all kinds of other measures that we're going to go into, like I said, in future references or future videos. And one of those that's very interesting to me is this concept of aerobic durability. What is the cardiac drift? When does your heart rate start going up under low intensity duration? And if you're not familiar with that concept, it's been around for a long time. If you're a big fan of Training Peaks or you follow Joe Friel, you'll probably have read it as aerobic decoupling, but in reality, the real term for it is cardiac drift. And we can look at that over time and see where you are. It's a very simple measure of your most recent best resting heart rate, and that is the resting heart rate that comes from sleep, not from ambient, meaning sitting on the couch. It is the lowest recorded heart rate while sleeping. And then you subtract that from your maximum heart rate. That becomes your low intensity durability heart rate. And you take a look at that measure and you start to watch where it starts to creep up. Where does it decouple? That's where it comes from Joe Friel. From your power. When does it start to climb above power? And when people ask me about power measurements and things like that, is there a point in time where power is not, heart rate's not useful? No, heart rate's always useful, but without the power data, it becomes very, very difficult for coaches to do a ton with an athlete. And that goes back to my most recent little webinar / coaches log on why I require my athletes to have power meters. I would also like to add to that just very recently, Alex Hutchinson posted an article on Outside magazine online about a shootout with the best running power meters, which it's not so much the best, but what's available. And I'm very happy to say that the Stride FootPod jumped out heads and shoulders above all other tested power meters for runners, which was not a big surprise. A lot of what I've learned over the time has mirrored those. So I digress. Back to honoring the injury, honoring the illness. In my particular case, I had an illness. And what does that mean? Well, that means that I stayed off the bike. I didn't really do any particular training. It wasn't until this weekend that I felt well enough to go for a real short walk and trust that, it was kind of me putting my toe back in the water to see how I was going to feel. Today, I will do a very easy recovery spin effort. Recovery spins, if you're not familiar with that concept, it's zone 1. If you're in a zone training program and you're looking for heart rate and or power, that is the lowest zone. I should be able to have a conversation like this with anyone that I was riding with. That's how low the perceived exertion is. And you're barely doing any work. It's kind of, what is my body going to do? I feel a lot better than I did in the middle of last week. And I've been very, very careful and very cautious during these times because the last thing anybody needs to do is get sick or injured. And so I'm no different, and that's why I'm sharing this with you. Now, honoring an injury, means all kinds of things. You really, I would say this, whether it's a simple overuse injury, maybe you've been fighting with shin splints, plantar fasciitis, maybe it's as simple as saddle sores. A lot of cyclists go through that. And, you know, with cycling and saddle sores specifically, there are some things that you might be able to get away with. I've coached a lot of multi-sport athletes as my career as a coach, and many times we transition away from the bike and onto something else. Maybe there's more of a focus on running or swimming because saddle sores aren't going to affect that. Usually not. There are some exceptions to that rule. But in other cases too with cyclists, we have found that maybe the saddle sores came about because of the road bike, the mountain bike, the gravel bike, and we switch them to a time trial bike or vice versa. And that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But anyway, outside of those types of illness/injuries, when I start taking a look at the bigger injuries, things like cyclists, you know, they've been dealt a blow. They've got a shoulder injury. Maybe they've crashed, broken their collarbone, or a couple of ribs. You know, I've been doing this for a while, that I have a lot of kind of expectations on what it takes to recover, only from experience working with other athletes and my own personal injuries, and understanding what your traditional physical therapists and sports medicine doctors and orthopedics are going to require of their athletes. Every now and then I might question something, but it's rare. I am always going to lean towards what the doctors tell me or tell my athlete. And I tell them, honor the doctor. Make sure that you do exactly what they tell you to do, nothing more, nothing less. And you're going to get back to feeling like your old self again. You're going to get healed a lot sooner. Now, of course, there's been other injuries that might be even more severe than a break. Concussion. Runners, that's pretty rare. I think that as far as road races go for runners, injuries really have a lot more to do with things like stress fractures, overuse injuries, plantar fasciitis, IT band issues, psoas issues. Those are pretty common. Knee issues, other hip issues. Typically, we don't see a lot of upper body issues with runners, probably more so with cyclists. But cyclists will have some of the same issues that runners have in the lower extremities, of course, but maybe not as acute. But in any case, we still need to honor what the doctors are telling us. You put rehab first, and then when you start working with me again, we start looking into things like prehab. What caused this in the first place? So if you've wrecked and you've had a couple of wrecks and you keep landing on the same shoulder, we've got a skills issue potentially to be dealing with. Yes, there are some cases where it's just bad luck, but once again, honor the injury, listen to the professionals, take the time down. It's not a gigantic loss. And I think in future recordings, we're going to talk about motivation and maintaining motivation, whether it's from COVID lockdown or from an injury or an illness. All right, everybody, that's all the time I really wanted to take on this, maybe a little bit too long, but I hope this helps. If you've got other questions or comments about this or other shows, or you've got ideas for other content, always leave a comment, and I would love to hear from everybody. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and also check that little bell if you want to get notification of when we've got new shows coming out. There will be more coming very soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your training week, and we'll talk again.